roundup topics I want to talk about. We get a lot of people who are always asking about tiny houses. So we got a few of here. So Justin from Virginia said, are there affordable plots of land and can you live tiny house style? My wife grew up there in the military and now most of our kids are out of the house. We're considering moving there. Or Natasha from Dallas said, hey, in doing price comparisons of buying a home versus a condo, I'm thinking more and more about buying a tiny house. Is tiny house living permissible in any of the islands? If so, what are the rules, regulations, and the costs associated? Thanks. And then finally, Alexandra in Washington, D.C. says, are tiny houses becoming more popular in the islands? So there's a bunch of questions about tiny houses. We've touched on this earlier, but let's do a roundup on this again. And Dylan, why don't we start with you? When people say, "Hey, what about tiny houses?" What's your response?
So actually, on my YouTube channel, I have a pretty detailed interview with a tiny house builder here on the Big Island that we go through a lot of these questions in detail. And I'm happy to connect anybody who wants to talk to him. I'll connect you with him so you can have a discussion directly because they have the most details. But in general, the thing that you got to understand about tiny homes is they're not technically homes. They're technically RVs because they build them on a trailer and they're movable. So that's one thing in terms of cost that makes them cost effective is that they're not a fully permitted, doesn't have architectural drawings. And that's what is one of the reasons why they're affordable. And so that also means that they're not a permanent structure. So there's some implications with that. You definitely can go through the process of getting them permitted and making them a permanent structure, but the costs are going to be higher. So sometimes you lose some of that cost benefit that you're looking for. But one of the things that you need to consider is that the electric company will not hook up grid power to a non-permanent structure. So what a lot of people are doing with tiny homes is they are putting them on properties that are already built. So, on a family property or a home that's already there, adding kind of a second non-permanent dwelling to a property and then hooking up to their wastewater, their water, their electric, and then using it as a guest home or an Airbnb or just as a second dwelling. So there's a lot to consider. It's not as simple as some people hope it would be, but it definitely can be done. I do know that my buddy Chad, who builds, he's from Mockingbird Tiny Homes. If you want to look him up online, he's extremely busy, like book 3 to 6 months out in terms of builds. He can build about 3 or 4 of them at a time. But they are gaining popularity because there is very affordable land on the island. And you can get a very nice tiny home for under $100,000. I mean, decked out with granite countertops and a full kitchen. And it's really amazing the kind of stuff they can do. They can go as simple or as custom and high-end as you want with a tiny home. So definitely my recommendation would be to talk to, especially for each island, the actual county zoning rules and regulations vary from island to island. So you want to talk to somebody specifically on the island who's dealing with it and ask your questions and make sure it works.
So kind of what I'm hearing you say, kind of quick summary, Dylan, is that it seems to be a lot of people are doing it for adding on a structure to an existing property that has existing utilities, water, home, etc., and kind of pipe this one in and add some kind of an additional dwelling. Whether or not it be the first dwelling you put on a property, that seems almost like you can't do it, at least on the Big Island, because the utility will not hook up power to a non, what you called it, a
non-permanent structure.
Non-permanent structure. Thank you. Yeah. It's a trailer, so it's seen as a trailer.
And one other thing, very important consideration is financing, right? Some people want to get a tiny home because it's cheaper, but do you have the cash to pay the 60, 70, 80,000 that it's going to cost? Because you can't get a residential loan. There are private lenders, rates are a little bit higher, terms are a little bit different. Again, tiny home builders will have those connections. But if you're thinking about using a VA loan or some kind of FHA loan or something like that, that's not going to be an option because it is not a permanent residence. So that's one thing you got to consider also.
Got it. That's a great angle. Okay, let's get the Maui angle. Heidi, are tiny homes becoming a thing on Maui? What's the, why would you want one or not want one? What's that all about?
Well, a lot of what Dylan said about the Big Island applies to Maui too. I mean, so you want to look at the zoning because Maui County zoning will determine how many dwellings are allowed on a parcel of land. And also any residential structure where people are living needs to have a building permit, and you would need also electric, wastewater, and plumbing. I mean, if you were going to tie into utilities. So, I mean, I think the way that tiny homes work is if it's on a wheeled trailer and completely off grid, or perhaps on, on a property with existing structures. So it's not as easy as I think a lot of people would like, but I mean, it is possible if that's the lifestyle that you're looking for. Now, it's probably not going to work in an established neighborhood or residential area. This is something you'd find, probably more in a more rural area.
Excellent. Yeah. Thanks, Heidi. I appreciate that. Again, you got this allure. You think, oh, tiny house means, cheap, tiny. I could get a tiny land and a tiny house and a tiny price and a tiny cost. And it's not that tiny all the way around. Scott, I have not seen tiny houses proliferate on Oahu, but then again, I don't look for them either. What's the deal with what's going on with tiny houses?
Yeah, well, part of the whole concept with tiny house is affordability as well. And one of the questions that was there is there affordable land on Oahu that you can buy to put a tiny house on? And the answer is no, not really. I mean, you're probably spending $400,000 minimum for the land. Hawaii is unique. We're out in the middle of the Pacific. If you look at it, we're a dot on the map, and we're limited in land. So our land is always the most expensive thing when it comes to the housing side of things. The structure itself is typically not worth as much as the land. So there's that challenge alone. I could see this more on the Big Island. And the main thing to understand with the tiny house portion is it's actually more, you go and get you pay your fees and stuff to the Department of Motor Vehicles. You don't go through the planning department because it's not considered a permanent structure. So, it's my understanding you could probably get them about $70,000. That's where they start and go up from there. And then you got to take into consideration how you do the water. Are you doing catchment, solar off grid? Then your wastewater, I can't imagine you're going down. If you're not a permanent structure, you can't go down to the Department of Health and get a septic system approved because they're like, what are you tying into this? Oh, motor vehicle? Wait, what? That doesn't make sense, right? So you have to look at it as if it's a Department of Motor Vehicles kind of thing and plan around that side. And then affordability becomes a challenge. It's not very popular here. I don't see it. I haven't seen any actually.
That's what I was thinking. I haven't seen any on Oahu.
Yeah, and CCNRs are going to come into play if you
what's
go into
CCNR. What's a CCNR?
They're covenants and restrictions on what you can do on that land that are going to be greater than city and county building codes. So if you go into a subdivision somewhere where they have restrictive covenants, that they're probably not going to allow for this type. So you got to be really careful. I can easily see this much more on the Big Island, Hawaiian Ocean View, some of those places, but Dylan can kind of talk about that.
Yeah, got it. And speaking of birds, speaking of sounds, Scott, I love the bird sounds. I love it. The sounds great. I love the sweet little bird sound. So good. I think we've touched base on anything else on tiny houses. If anybody else wants to add anything in, jump that one in. But that's been a topic that we're going to kind of break this one out as a segment and. So everyone knows. So Dylan, thanks for go ahead.
Scott touched on it, but that's another very important factor in the cost analysis of this is say you do build a septic system that you tie into without approval, right? That can be $25,000. If you're going to be off the grid because you can't hook up to Helco, I mean, to get a system that is going to run a regular home is probably going to be $25,000 to $30,000 minimum for a solar system. And then you got to build a catchment system if you're not tied up to water, which could be $5,000 or $10,000 for a good catchment system and tank. So those are all costs, again, that you're not necessarily going to be able to finance it to some type of loan and could be upfront costs. So cash available may be an important factor in all of this from a financing perspective.
And it's my understanding you can go and get like a personal line of credit potentially and finance it that way, but you're not doing a home loan because it's not considered a permanent structure that's been permitted.
Right. Yep. You can get a credit. You can finance it on your credit card, if you will, if your credit card, if your limits is that big. Yeah. Got it. Nina chimed in. Tiny houses are either post and pier or on trailers, which require DMV rules. That's exactly right. If it's a DMV's Department of Motor Vehicle, if it falls under a whole set of rules, and just like with Department of Motor Vehicles, you can't get home loans on your vehicle. You can't get hookups on your vehicle. You can't hook into the septic system, etc. So yeah, what I'm getting out of this is it's complicated. It's not as simple as you might think it is. Just because it's tiny doesn't mean it's cheap. And there's a bunch of overhead that's associated that you got to get done no matter what size house that you have to get at the end of the day. But it might be for you. You want to kind of talk with people who know what they're doing. And that's why I'm so grateful to have people like Dylan, who's on the Big Island, and Heidi, who's on Maui, and Scott, who's on Oahu. We're giving kind of the full statewide view. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate all the input. All right, let's
And one more quick perspective on
sure,
cost,
sure,
right?
sure.
Places
sure.
like Scott's talking about, the places, the rural places where you would do something like this, where you can get a plot of land for $10,000 or $20,000, you can get a brand new house pretty much between $200,000 and $300,000, right? With all of the utilities put in and a home already built. So when you kind of add up the cost, you almost get somewhere near that, right? You can easily spend $100,000 just in the tiny home. Then all of the additional stuff that you need to make it livable could run you another $100,000. Now you're in like a $200,000 range where you could just buy a full, an already built home in the same exact area.
And with the already built and with the full built home, don't forget, a tiny house is by definition tiny. So you drop maybe 200,000 as opposed to 100,000. 100,000 for a tiny home, 200,000 for a quote real home. And what you've got 2 bedrooms, maybe three bedrooms, a bathroom, a full shower, a full kitchen, a backyard, a porch, a front door, a back door, windows, lots of windows. All those great conveniences. So yeah. Absolutely. Great.